Okay, so thanks. Okay, a lot of animals don't have a nervous system, or don't have a very well-developed one. Sponges don't. Looks like they're the first animals that are at the base of the animal tree of life. But the next stage up are things like jellyfish and sea anemones. They only have 2 layers instead of 3 layers of tissue, but they have what's called a nerve net. So there are neurons, but there's no central area for it. But they can do things like jellyfish. You can see them if they're with their big bells. They can actually make it through the water. They can move, not very well, but good enough for what they need to do. As you get to more and more complex animals, and that corresponds with time, you start seeing central nervous systems. So individuals who have 2 of everything, 2 eyes, 2 kidneys, all that kind of stuff, different sizes of the body. Those things kind of tend to have a more advanced immune system, and that includes insects, right? So insects have a decent immune system. Neurons, sorry. And then, of course, you get over to vertebrates, and vertebrates have a very good nervous system. It gets more and more complex the more recent that lineage actually evolved. So the most advanced nervous systems that you find usually are in, let's say, birds and mammals. But it also looks like, in fact, that there's a lot of fish that are pretty smart in terms of cognition, just so you know. So the central part of the central nervous system is the brain, and then you have the spinal cord. And then you have all these sense organs. So being able to see, being able to hear, being able to smell, being able to taste, and then touch. And in fact, our whole bodies are kind of wired for touching, especially if you actually look at the number of neurons in our fingertips. They're much higher density in their fingertips than, let's say, a patch of skin on your back. So, now, in terms of neurons, they have similar properties. Okay, there's different kinds of neurons. So this does not require thinking. These are kind of automatic reflexive. You have sensory neurons. So the tip of my tongue, I have all these taste buds, and I can taste all sorts of different kinds of chemicals. Sweet things, sour things, bitter things, savory things, all kinds of different things. Obviously, smell, same sort of way. So these are all sensory organs. They pick up what's going on in the outside world. There are some animals that have other senses than what humans do. For example, bats and also a lot of marine mammals can send out a signal like sonar, and they can actually get a picture of what their environment looks like because of the signals coming back. There's also a lot of fish that are electric fish, but weakly electric. And they use electrical fields for the same sort of thing. Okay? So, sensory neurons, and then they're usually connected in some way to interneurons that carry signals from the sensory neurons, a lot of times up to the brain, but also to motor neurons. Okay, so it goes from sensory neurons to interneurons to motor neurons, and then motor neurons cause things to happen, like, let's say, muscle contraction. That's the effector. So reflexes are involuntary in response to some stimulus. So you've gone to the doctor where they tap your knee and your knee goes up and down and you don't have any control over it. Reaction to unexpected painful stimuli, right? Put your hand on something hot and you immediately take it away. Salivation in response to smells and gag response in terms of noxious stimuli. Now, these kinds of things do not require any thinking whatsoever. So let's say a monster comes into this room. A pig, dog, bear from South Park. And we know it's dangerous, we can tell. We don't think about what we should do at that time. We all jump out of our clothes and then we run away. Okay? Or we freeze. Those are both reflective responses. If you actually had to think about something in that situation, you would probably be dead. Oh, what should I do now? Eat. It's already eaten you. So a lot of reflexes we have no control over them whatsoever. Now, cognitive responses, where we're aware of what we're doing, that's a different story. There's a different part of the nervous system that controls that. So, as I said, this is sensory neurons, interneurons, motor neurons, and then effectors, which are the things the neurons are actually attached to that actually do the work, whether it's muscles, whether it's secreting certain substances from glands like the thymus and the adrenal glands and all that. Now, there's, I guess you could divide the nervous system into two parts. And that's the central nervous system, brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, which means all the nerve roots and nerves that are emanating from different parts of the spinal cord. And like I said, our body is absolutely covered in nerves. Some areas more so than others. So, in terms of vertebrates, the central nervous system, the brain is usually covered in a skull, hard bony plates, and the spinal cord is too, in terms of vertebrates. So, here's the vertebral column. And then, in terms of the skull, well, first of all, so here's the vertebral column, right? Pretty well protected. Some people get spinal injuries, and they usually are quadriplegic or paraplegic, but things are changing on that route in terms of stem cell therapies. And in the future, people might actually be able to recover. The brain has the skull, which is right there. Here's the spinal cord. The meninges, let's see here. I want to make sure I'm looking at this. I'm not sure. They're a thin layer that protects nervous system tissue. So like you can actually get a disease called spinal meningitis, which is infectious. It used to kill a lot of people. It's treatable by antibiotics now. Where those meninges get infected, you usually get a terrible headache. With really bad infections, of course, you can die. And then there's also, the brain is protected with a blood-brain barrier. In other words, it's protected so that things can't get through. Yeah?
Let's say you experience 1 or 2 concussions, like in the past.
Yeah.
Would it come back to haunt you down the line?
What's that?
Would it come back to haunt you and like hurt you down the
Oh, you mean getting after you've gotten a concussion?
Yeah, let's say like a younger.
Well, they used to think not. Really bad concussions, obviously, perhaps. But they're thinking now more so because of all the football concussions that they're seeing, and they're seeing, in fact, that even, kids that don't go on to play college or pro, they can sometimes have lingering effects. And now you're seeing it with pro football players especially. What was it called? Anyway, there's a lot of old football players who are, they have real serious dementia from too many blows to the head. Boxers used to get the same sort of thing, punch drunk, right? So over time, that sort of thing can actually, have long-lasting effects. Now, the NFL didn't want to admit that for a long time. In fact, no one did, but the evidence is very strong now. So there's a whole protocol. Whether it actually protects people or not, it's hard to say. Really young kids that, let's say, have a brain injury, whether it's a concussion or something more serious, are much more likely to recover from normal function than an old brain like me. Okay? So in terms of the nervous system. So there's a lot more plasticity in the young brain and nervous system than older people. Now, this blood-brain barrier protects the brain from infectious diseases. So now occasionally you get infections like of the meninges and stuff like that. But there's this whole setup so that things can't get through. In fact, the only energy molecules that it can get through are actually glucose. So nothing other than glucose passes through the blood-brain barrier. It's a good thing. It's also a thing that's kind of problematic because if you want to, let's say you want to administer drugs in terms of a brain problem, you have to be able to get it through the blood-brain barrier. So you just can't inject it or do an IV or something like that. You actually have to go use like a spinal tap or something like that to inject the drugs in, because otherwise they won't get through. So now, the brain has a tremendous amount of a blood supply. And you can understand that because the brain actually uses about 20% of all the energy that we consume. It's voracious. In other words, it's great that we are able to do these things, but it's very, very expensive. As an aside, that's why, some people say, oh, we're more highly evolved because we have a bigger brain and better cognitive capacity. Well, in a lot of cases, there's animals that don't, but they have much higher fitness than having a big brain because you spend such a large cost in terms of nutrients and things like that. So anyway, there's this blood circulation and blood supply of the brain, carotid artery, lots of capillaries, so that very fine blood vessels. When people get a stroke, it's usually because one of the arteries or one of the blood vessels is blocked. so the brain can't get oxygen, things like that. So the central nervous system has an amazing blood supply, and it has to. Now, this is the brain stem. Okay, right here, which is right here. It governs a whole bunch of stuff. It does not require cognitive thought. So it covers heartbeats, breathing, swallowing, a whole bunch of automatic functions. Is actually part of what's called the autonomous nervous system. The part of your nervous system that does not need, I mean, it just goes on and on and on if it's working properly. We don't have to think about breathing. We don't think about having to have, oh, beep, beep, beep. Don't have to do that, okay? So the brainstem, people usually with brainstem injuries, they're dead. They may be kept alive, but essentially they're going to be brain dead. Okay, there's other parts. Let's see, the cerebellum right here, a lot of motor control. Thalamus is a gland for relaying sensory information. There's a lot of hormones that are associated with it. The cerebrum. Now, there's a whole bunch of different parts to it, but the cerebral cortex, the outer part, is definitely associated with cognitive thought. And from what I understand, the frontal lobe, like is part of your executive function in terms of planning, making decisions, things like that. So there's a kind of dementia that happens with some people in terms of they lose control of their executive functions. There's also different parts that are associated with like language, Broca's area, obviously areas that are dedicated to sight, hearing. Oftentimes what happens is, let's say someone becomes blind or they're born blind. A lot of that area that was for sight is actually becomes rewired for dedicated for other things like better sound and hearing. So the brain is fairly plastic in how it can get rewired, especially early on. Now, it's kind of an amazing organ because it's not just, okay, you get senses coming in, but it has to integrate sight, sound. So you see something like that big, oh, we're just about ready to go. You know, a monster come in here. It has to integrate that sight and then the rest of our responses in terms of making the appropriate reactions. So we'll leave it there for now, and then we'll pick up next week where we'll finish up. Look at Top Hat for some new questions. So I just wanted to start the morning off on an up note about brain death and coma. When you're brain dead, it's not good. When you're in a coma, it depends on how deep. But you could be brain dead too. Beyond that, I have not much to say. Actually, let's see. Usually with brain death, it's the, what is it called? That has some damage. Anyway, They can record brain activity with an EEG. They also do a functional MRI or an MRI or a CAT scan or a PET scan, all sorts of different things to figure out what's going on. Anyway, try to avoid it. Well, neurons, they don't really replace themselves very well. In terms of memory, you can think about it this way. If you have a neuron that, let's say, gets damaged, that actually carries memory, then you can't replace it anyway, right? But in general, neurons are difficult to actually repair, or in some cases impossible. I mean, occasionally you can, like one of the peripheral neurons, it'll get cut and then you can actually kind of reattach it, like at the end, the tip of the finger or something like that, but it's generally not so good. As far as what a neuron actually looks like, so up at the top are dendrites. This is where synapses occur. Impulses come from here, travel down what's called the axon, and then goes to the terminal. And at which point, there's things that you've probably heard about called neurotransmitters, like dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, a whole bunch of them, GABA. And these are the things that actually carry electrical impulses. So we'll go into this in more. So for a neuron to actually function, it needs enough of a signal that it actually carries it. So a nerve impulse entry of any, these are positive ions like calcium ions right here, okay, into the cell causes a chain reaction that propagates along the length of the axon. Okay, so let's see. No, actually there's sodium ions, so sorry. And then potassium ions. So these are sodium, potassium. So you get propagation of action potential across the nerve impulse, and then finally down again. Okay. Oh, there's another thing. Many neurons actually have what's called this myelin sheath, and that protects the neurons. It's actually a bunch of cells called Schwann cells collectively. It's the part of nerves that are damaged in multiple sclerosis. So what happens is multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. Everybody remember what an autoimmune disease is? Anybody? You're trying. I know you're trying. Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So it has something to do with the immune system, right? Autoimmune. Auto is same. Means the same immune. So is it? Do you think it's an immune system attack against foreign things or the body? The body, exactly. There's a ton of autoimmune diseases. There's some thought that maybe they're increasing. They include everything from multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes. There's tons of them for almost every kind of tissue in the body. Anyway, for multiple sclerosis, it's the Schwann cells that are attacked. And when that happens, then basically you have leakage. Just think about a wire that's got a kind of a plastic sheath along it, right? Well, a lot of wires do, so that you don't have leakage across wires, right? Same sort of principle here. Yeah, so there we go. I was ahead of myself. So what happens is, now, usually once an attack starts, that may be it, and there may be no further attacks. Also, there are ways to actually damp down the immune system with steroids, and there are some drugs that are coming onto the market that actually are targeted for multiple sclerosis that might actually prove very helpful in stopping the attack. Oh, so antigen-specific therapy. Basically, you create an antigen, which is what the immune system recognizes as foreign. So, and an autoimmune system, or a disease, the immune system targets itself, but it considers that antigen of whatever tissue that is to be non-self, right? So in this case, you can, in a sense, kind of distract so that those antigens, these other antigens actually get the immune response and not the Schwann cells. Now, there's also a little bit of work on stem cells therapy, but I'm not really sure. At this point, there's nothing really happening there. So what happens is you have one of these kinds of immune system cells. This is a macrophage. Oops. Attacks the myelin sheath. Here you can see perforations and perhaps replacement of lost myelin-producing cells. These would be stem neuron cells. So this is how I'm going to go through the function of neurons. So once the signal reaches the axon terminal, it triggers the release of small molecules called neurotransmitters. And these are all a bunch of neurotransmitters that are crossing this gap. And they're going to hit these receptor cells right at the ends of these dendrites, which are the beginning of the next neuron. Okay, so what happens is these neurotransmitters propagate across that gap. That's called the synapse. Yeah, okay. That's that area right there. Okay? Now let's... Now the electrical signal is actually a chemical signal. So you have to understand ions are molecules that are either positively or negatively charged. So ions are what actually carries the actual signal. And it can be carried in a chemical fashion. And so these neurotransmitters actually do that. We'll get a look at more closely what happens here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Anyway, so the transmission of the impulse across the synapse, this is that area right in here. There are these vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. What they do is they release, when they come to the end of the terminal, they then release the neurotransmitters, which then propagate across. And let's see. You can see they go to these receptors, right? So these go into the receptors, right? And then once the receptors fill up to a certain point, there's no more release of neurotransmitter. Okay. And then this is the head of the next neuron right here, right? And this is the dendrite. So let's go back and take a look. In other words, here's the dendrite. So what happens is it travels down to the terminal and then crosses this thing into this new dendrite. Okay? Now, once these neurotransmitters cross this barrier and they fill up all these spaces, then a lot of them are digested by these enzymes and then reused. A lot of them also are there's reuptake. So the ones that aren't used anymore go back into vesicles and are used later. So here's a kind of a list of some. Acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, you've probably heard of those, dopamine and serotonin. Glutamate, GABA. The amount of neurotransmitters varies in terms of the region of the brain. So we're going to be talking a little bit about these SSRIs, which are serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are used for depression and things like that. And the reason they don't work perfectly is because they target all serotonin synapses and then those neurotransmitters, and not just the ones that need to be actually focused on. So many of the diseases like, most of them of mental health like depression, bipolar disease, have a lot to do with neurotransmitters in some way or another. And they can be treated, like I said, with drugs, some of which are much better than in the past. Let's see here. What did I want to say? Yes, it'll come to me. Okay, so we'll look at depression first. And this is just straight depression, not bipolar. So then there's a neurotransmitter imbalance, low serotonin levels. So you actually use drugs to increase serotonin levels, and you do this by stopping the reuptake of serotonin in the synapse. So let's take a look. Okay. Okay. So the red dots are the drug, the molecules of the drug, and they block the reuptake of these neurotransmitters up to here, right? So the impulse propagates across, and instead of reaching a stage where it turns off the release of neurotransmitters, what it does is it keeps these neurotransmitters in the synapse and keeps the propagation of the signal going over the synapse from one neuron to the other. So these are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. The ones you probably heard about, Zoloft. The first one was Prozac. There's a whole bunch of them. Let's see, Paxil, Effexor, there's a ton of them. Some work better for some people than others. So oftentimes, and it also takes a while usually before the effects actually show up. So usually when they put someone on a SSRI, it's not at least for perhaps 3 weeks or a month before you actually start seeing an effect. They also have, a lot of them have side effects that are unpleasant. So that's why a lot of people kind of cycle through different ones until they find one that kind of has minimum side effects that works well enough for them. So most drugs that do affect the nervous system actually affect neurotransmitters in some way. So SSRIs, drugs that affect serotonin, right? They inhibit reuptake, so it allows the neurotransmitters to remain in the synapse longer. Some drugs cause release of stored neurotransmitter. Let's take a look. So in this case, vesicles release stored dopamine and release into the synapse. Another can mimic the neurotransmitter itself, activating receptors on the postsynaptic. So in this last one, you can have a drug that might actually bind to these receptors instead of the neurotransmitter. So we actually have opioid receptors in our brain. You would think, well, why? Well, it's part of the whole system. It doesn't mean that we have opioids so we can enjoy doing heroin. Okay? I don't want you to get the idea that it was made for that. It's part of the opioid system is part of the neurotransmitter system. It just so happens that opioids bind to those sites very readily. So another one is the party drug, ecstasy, and then there's LSD, all that kind of stuff. Anybody in here try ecstasy? Go to a party and try ecstasy? Oh, come on. Someone has to. No? Okay. You already know about me and LSD, right? Okay, so we don't have to go into that anymore. So, ecstasy, feelings of well-being can also interfere with thermoregulation. It stimulates serotonin release at the synapses. So there can be then a depletion of serotonin. And what will happen is the actual effects of the drug will wear off. So it's not like you can keep taking MMDA or ecstasy time every day. It's not like opioids. LSD is the same way. There's diminishing returns. So it's not like you can trip out for a whole week. It just doesn't work that way. Now, you probably heard in the news recently about using ecstasy for, what was it? Anybody heard about that? Oh, anyway, for treating, no, they were talking about psilocybin, same sort of thing. Using psilocybin and also ecstasy to treat various things like addiction, because these drugs, like LSD and MMDA and psilocybin, they're not addictive at all, because they deplete the neurotransmitters, and so they stop working very quickly. In terms of the dopamine system, so ADD. Now, this is, they're putting a lot of kids on things to block dopamine. So Ritalin is a reuptake blocker. So it keeps the dopamine in the synapse longer, like the serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Now, if you think about little kids, they usually don't have a really long attention span, do they? It seems like it's asking a bit much for them to sit in a chair for more than, let's say, if they're 8 years old, for more than 10 minutes before they start to get really fidgety. That's the nature of things. Yet, because they do that to kids, and they don't sit in a chair very well for 10 minutes, they give them drugs. Now, in the past also, obviously there's variation. We're talking here evolution again. You need variation for evolution to occur. Well, there's a range in terms of how people's neural system actually works. And in terms of personality and behavior, some people are much more amped up than others. I mean, you've probably met some of those people in your life that are really, they can't sit in a chair for more than 2 minutes. Now, in the past, let's say we're hunter-gatherers, that was fine. The kid's running around outside all the time, burning up energy, and eventually, you know, it's not like he has to sit anywhere and listen to his folks. They might be pointing things out to him. You know, he might eventually get up to, he or she, up to a certain age, and they can still start following their parents around and learn stuff. But it's not a classroom learning situation. Well, this is what we do to kids. And kids that are like that are the ones that are going to have problems. So there's a lot of, at the first sign of this kind of ADD, they usually oftentimes start kids on Ritalin or some other dopamine reuptake inhibitor. And then hopefully what it does is it tends to calm the kids down so that they can actually concentrate. I actually tutor kids that are, you know, poor kids in Canoga Park. And they're like any other kids. They get bored or they get distracted after sitting for too long. So when I'm tutoring them, I don't make them just sit there. I give them, every once in a while, I say, get up and run around the playground as much as you want for the next 5 minutes. And don't sit there. I want to see you run. They come back in, and then they're better able to concentrate. You know, they're not, it's another new thing to do is come back in the classroom and read about pirates or something like that, right? So there's ways to get around fidgety kids. And that's, instead of making them sit and do one thing for, let's say, half an hour, it's too much. You just can't do it. It's not effective. At least that's my opinion. Now, I've also known cases where there are some kids that are so hyped up that this really does work, and it can actually have good effects, especially over the long run, where the kid, after a certain amount of time, doesn't need them anymore. Okay? So just so you know, that there are actually legitimate uses for these drugs, and not just to keep the kids kind of drugged and in line. Okay, so normally reuptake of dopamine will limit signaling across the synapses. Dopamine persists longer in the synapse. Ritalin inhibits the reuptake, just like SSRIs do for serotonin, and then stimulates neurons that regulate attentiveness. Okay? That's basically how they work. Now, it turns out that Ritalin is in a class of drugs that also include other stimulants like cocaine. Now, you would wonder, why give kids who are bouncing off the walls a stimulant? It's kind of interesting, but it actually has a calming effect on children, unlike adults. Some of the active sites are very much like cocaine, which is obviously a stimulant. So Ritalin oftentimes is kind of low dose, slow release. And then cocaine, obviously, you want immediate effects. Usually people snort it. Some people shoot it. Some people used to freebase it until they caught themselves on fire, like Richard Pryor. So don't do that, okay? So, in terms of addiction, a drug is more likely to be addictive if its effects are immediate, euphoric, and of short duration. Now, that sounds a lot like certain psychedelic drugs, which are not addictive. Okay? Now, a lot of psychedelic drugs last longer than, let's say, a couple of hours, like cocaine, which is short time. Let's see, heroin. I don't know how long heroin lasts. But LSD lasts you a long time. But there are some psychedelics that actually last a very short time.
Like nitrous oxide?
What?
Like nitrous oxide?
No, that's not. That's a different sort of thing. So it's not a psychedelic.
Have you heard about that though?
Oh yeah, sure. In fact, for a while there, dentists were dosing themselves after a hard day's work, and then they started showing up with symptoms that looked like multiple sclerosis. So they stopped doing that. But yes, it's called, what is it, laughing gas, is that right? So I remember asking the dentist to give me laughing gas once just to figure out what it was. And yeah, it totally cracked me up. Everything did. Now maybe that was just a suggestion. I already knew it's laughing gas, you have to laugh. And then another time I was at a party and people had a big canister of laughing gas. You know, and so you take that with helium, you make a funny voice, it just totally cracks you up. Anything is funny.
How much did you pay for it?
What?
How much did you pay for it?
Oh, I didn't pay for it. No, that someone just had a canister of it. You know, it's not like I'm going to pay for a canister and every time I'm totally bummed out. I'll take a sniff. Oh, I feel much better. Talk about coma today. Let's talk about coma. It's so much fun. Brain death, no problem. You're totally cracked up. Okay. But there are certainly drugs that are very addictive. Opioids, for example, there's an opioid addiction crisis going on in the country right now, as you've probably heard. Most of those started because doctors were pushing opioids for pain relief. And opioids are not good for long-term pain relief, precisely because they're addictive. And they also lose their effect. So you need higher and higher doses. So what happens is, if you give someone, let's say, a dose of, oh, what is it? What's the one that killed Prince? Anyway, I forget. But it's a strong synthetic opioid. What happens is, if you give someone who's never had an opioid before a dose that someone who's been taking it for a while, they'll usually die. They'll just go into respiratory arrest. But over time, you build up to a level where you almost need the stuff just to feel halfway decent. Unfortunately, then you're getting to the point where there's going to be a certain point, no matter how habituated you are to the drug, where you're going to get into dangerous territory, because an opioid like heroin or a Vicodin or any of those other ones, you'll get to the point where it's still toxic. It'll suppress respiratory function and all that. And so people sometimes titrate themselves above, just they're right at the edge because they've been using it for so long, and a little bit above, and they start to OD. It's mostly, in terms of opioids, it's mostly happening in a lot of places in rural America. A lot of it starts because people are in pain, they go to a doctor. Now, in the beginning, doctors were just prescribing it, and it was no big deal, and then, of course, you start seeing people who are addicted. And so now it's been cracked down, and doctors, if they start prescribing too much and they're found out, they'll be disbarred from practicing medicine for pushing pills. These doctors, well, now that it's more restricted, people are going back to buying heroin. But in the past, heroin was expensive. Now it's really cheap. For one thing, the cartels in Mexico actually grow it in Mexico and not just in Afghanistan. So it's a lot cheaper. Anyway. And then the drug has to be capable of inducing tolerance and withdrawal. That means you can use more and more of it just to get the same effect. And then if you stop it, you start going into drug withdrawal, and it can be pretty unpleasant, to put it mildly. I never went through that, just so you know. I'm really not I'm not addictive in that way, like in drinking too much or anything. It's just my genes, I guess. But I just don't get addicted to anything like that. I mean, I've tried all those things, but don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't stick. Oh, methamphetamine. This is another drug of rural America. It's a stimulant. Breaking Bad, you guys probably saw some of that. What?
She said she doesn't know what the blue one is.
Oh, it's just meth. They're going to inject it. So you'll put it in a solution and inject it. Yeah, so. It's cheap, easy to make. You can also blow yourself up when you're making it because you need a lot of volatile organic chemicals. For a while there, you could get the starting ingredients from certain cold medicines, and then use those to make methamphetamine. And also, methamphetamine, it tends to make you start to melt. Now you may say, how do people melt? Well, they do. Long-term use, or a lot of it over a short period of time, they start getting lesions on their face, their skin sags, their teeth fall out. They're bloody miserable in short order. They also tend to be completely paranoid after using it for a certain amount of time, like they're always out to get me. which may be somewhat true since they're out to get them for using it, but yeah, what?
So if they have users on the phrase, that's meth, not crack.
I guess if you overuse crack somewhat, but meth is the one that really, you just kind of fall apart. It's horrible. I could go, here, what is it? Anyway, stay away from this shit. Okay, so drugs that alter behavior, do so by altering neurotransmitter signaling. When they used appropriately, these drugs can be used to treat disorders that arise from neurotransmitter deficiencies. Schizophrenia, somewhat, but schizophrenia is, it's a very, very difficult disease to treat. In the past, they just gave people what were essentially things that were, that really kind of put you in a trance or a stupor. So, stuff that works on dopamine receptors are Ritalin, meth, cocaine, serotonin, ecstasy, LSD, probably psilocybin. And it has to do, addiction generally has to do with how the nature and timing of the drug's addiction. But like I said, the serotonin drugs, they're generally not addictive. Because you quickly deplete the serotonin, and so you have to wait for the system to build it back up. Oh, okay, we're going to start talking about zombies. Who in here believes about zombies? Okay, good. Now, there is this parasite called Toxoplasmosis gondii. It's a single-celled eukaryotic parasite. It can alternate between asexual and sexual reproduction. And the life cycle generally goes from mice who pick it up to cats who eat the mice, who then defecate, and then starts all over again. The thing is, it turns out T. gondii can actually, it also affects other animals, now, including humans. The thing is, for the most part, it was thought that the immune system insists these little tiny parasites, and there's no further problem with it. But there's some questions about that. Okay. So, in terms of sexual reproduction, it can only happen in a cat's intestine. You know, sorry, that's what the cat says. It wasn't me. Anyway, and that animals that come into contact feces can be infected. And you may know that mice and rats, anything that has feces, they're like on it. Okay. Infection in people is usually not serious, but it can change the behavior of an intermediate host, in this case, rodents. Okay, so rodents that have been infected with toxoplasmosis are attracted to cat odors, which is weird, right? Why would they be attracted to cat odors? And also, they have slowed reaction times. When they lose their fear of cat odors and they have slower reaction times, you know, they're usually back in the primary host, which is a cat. So the toxo life cycle. Now, toxoplasmosis also has a lot to do with neurotransmitters. In this case, dopamine. Okay, so the parasite carries the genes that required to synthesize dopamine. In other words, this little one-celled parasite releases dopamine. Now, dopamine makes the cat feel pretty good about itself, and it can infect a lot of different mammalian neurons and increase dopamine levels. Okay, so it has some effects on the actual neurological function of a lot of mammals. Also, it can actually travel through our cells and not just between them. In other words, it can infect the neuron, travel through it, and then emerge down the line. Okay. Toxoplasmosis in humans is not serious unless one is immunocompromised or is pregnant. A woman is pregnant. So in other words, if you're pregnant, you have a cat, don't change the litter box. Okay? Not good. In HIV patients, one of the things that killed them was toxoplasmosis in the brain. Okay, so it would come out where it can actually asexually reproduce. Normally, it's encysted and it can't do anything. We can get toxo from eating infected animals and from scooping up cat litter. And, of course, we could also get it from eating mice. But eating rodents is not all that bad. They do in a lot of places in the world, right? If you cook it well, I think you'd be okay. Okay. Let me go back 1 second to the life cycle. So, because the parasite actually releases dopamine, cats are attracted. Mice and rodents are attracted to cats. It's kind of like they just waltz in. In fact, in a lot of cases, it seems like it stimulates part of the endocrine system that has to do with sex, like testosterone or estrogen or something like that. So in other words, a mouse looks at a cat and says, I think I want to have sex with this guy. Now, remember about praying mantises, about the females biting the heads off, but this is a little different, so just keep that in mind. Now, for a long time it was thought that it didn't affect humans, but there was some recent evidence that people who are infected with toxo, usually a quarter of the population, something like that. Like I said, our brain, it usually ends up in the brain, and it insists. So there's a kind of a thing around the parasite, so it can't do anything. But there's some evidence that, in fact, it does occasionally get out and start doing stuff. And it tends to affect human behavior. Let's see. What does it do? It says, okay, so there were different, in terms of personality factors, toxo-infected and uninfected subjects in 9 of 11 studies, and these differences were not the same for men and women. After using a statistics thing, the personality of infected men showed lower superego strength, the rule of consciousness, and higher vigilance. Thus, these men were more likely to disregard the rules around them. And infected women, by contrast, showed higher warmth and higher superego, suggesting they were more warm-hearted, conscientious, outgoing. Men tend to be jealous, rule-defiant, stubborn. It turns out it looks like men get in more traffic accidents, those who are infected, and into road rage sort of situations. It's very, very weird. Okay. So how would you actually do an experiment? So the hypothesis is that T. gondii actually affects the behavior of human beings, those who have it and those who don't. Anybody remember how we used to test hypotheses?
Just infect someone with it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the government would stop us from doing that. It's really it's a bummer. You just can't test stuff on people like you can, these other animals. But anyway, that's what you would do. You take a whole bunch of people, and you'd actually infect some with T. gondii and not the others. And then you'd predict, of course, there'd be kind of behavioral differences, and you might be able to measure some of those, whatever those behavioral differences are. And you can always use it as a defense. So you do something really stupid, and you say, it was a cat. Okay, and that's the end of it, right? They'll take that and consider it. Schizophrenia. It usually starts showing up as a teenager or young adult years. It basically results in a disorganized mind. People have suggested at times that schizophrenia, some great artists were schizophrenic, but probably not. Now, there's some that were bipolar, and during the manic phase, they maybe did lots of creative stuff. But schizophrenia is just a jumbled mess in your mind. They use dopamine drugs that decrease dopamine levels, but they have really bad side effects. Okay. And then there's obviously a genetic component to schizophrenia, but there also might have something to do with early development, stress. I don't know. It's hard to say. Oh, yeah. So there is a correlation between T. gondii infection and those who start exhibiting schizophrenic-like behavior. So schizophrenia actually might be a bunch of different diseases that show similar symptoms in terms of neurological symptoms. Remember, okay, men infected are 6 times more likely to be in traffic accidents than unaffected men. Okay. Men infected, men who are risk-taking are more likely to be infected by T. gondii. That's a stretch. So there actually might be some causation there. You'd have to really test it, though, with a good experiment, and it's hard to do with people. Oh, another thing. I want to say one thing. It turns out there are a lot of parasites actually affect transmission from one individual to another by infecting the brains of the hosts. Whether it's the mice in T. gondii or these ants that affect the brain, these fungus that affects the brain that makes the ant want to climb to the highest point it can find and then lock in. Rabies is another example. It's a virus, so it's not just eukaryotic parasites. And rabies is transmitted from one individual to the next. And usually, let's say you have an animal like a raccoon or a dog that contracts it. Carriers tend to be, by the way, the definitive hosts are usually bats in terms of rabies. They don't show any signs necessarily, well, some, but not a lot. And then animals, mammals, let's say, that are infected, it makes them want to bite other animals, so including dogs biting humans. And then humans, of course, when they get it, they start acting very strange. So parasites, it's kind of weird, but they actually take over the minds like zombies of all sorts of different creatures to enhance transmission from one host to another. So it's just kind of interesting.